This Florida bog holds a startling secret. From its depths emerge over 160 prehistoric skeletons, miraculously preserved. These 7,000-year-old remains look only 2 years dead. And there's something inside their skulls to astound the scientific world. Now, cutting-edge forensic techniques expose extraordinary detail of the lives of these Native American ancestors, revealing early human behavior, more skilled, caring, and peaceful than ever known. But one burial suggests something darker, a brutal mutilation.
This whole case is shocking, and the manner of death certainly appears like it's a homicide.
After thousands of years, the ancients emerge from their marsh to divulge unexpected clues in this riddle of the dead. The story begins over 2 decades ago. Just miles from the Space Shuttle launch pad, Florida, Steve Vanderjagt clears a route through a marshy pond, known as the Windover Bog, for the construction of a new housing estate. As his digger scoops peaty soil, something catches his eye. At first, he thinks it's a rock.
Found it a little strange because you don't see a lot of rocks and stones here coming out. So I jumped off to take a look to see what it was that I did pick up out of there. And as I turned it around, it was looking at me.
A human skull. Steve thinks he's stumbled across a homicide scene. The remains of a murder victim dumped in the bog.
Maybe some foul play, maybe an accident. Maybe somebody stumbled off in there, you don't know.
A police coroner examines the gruesome discovery, but its dark brown color tells him the skull has rested in the bog far too long to be a modern-day murder victim. This is no police matter. This death happened a long, long time ago. But who was this? How did he die? And why was his skull in the marsh? The police phone archaeologist Glenn Doran, then a young assistant professor at Florida State University and expert in human bones. The call will change his life. Windover is about to become one of North America's most important archaeological sites.
There was a relatively small, little nasty water black pond, and at first glance, it didn't look like a particularly inviting place for an archaeological site. But then we got out and we started walking up and down and looking at the piles of peat. And within just a few minutes, we started seeing clusters of human skeletal material.
He unearths 4 more skulls, and something straight away gives a clue to the age of these people: their dramatic dental wear. Modern people only use their teeth for chewing food, but in ancient cultures, teeth were all-purpose tools.
You could look at the teeth and instantly see that it was clearly somebody who had lived, thousands of years ago.
But Glenn is cautious. To date, most human remains found in North America are much younger than 2,000 years. A technique called radiocarbon dating will measure the amount of radioactive carbon in the bone to reveal when they died.
So we took some of the bone samples, sent them off to the lab, and then it was a waiting game.
When the results come in, they are truly jaw-dropping. Glenn suspected the skulls were old, but not this old. These people had lived over 7,000 years ago.
We were really walking on clouds. I mean, it's just unbelievable. It exceeded our expectation. Well, we knew we had this just incredible once-in-a-lifetime opportunity.
The bog would become an unprecedented window into a mysterious prehistoric age in North America. 5,000 years before the birth of Christ. 3,000 years before the construction of the pyramids, and 2,000 years before Stonehenge. Glenn suspects that the bog holds more than just 5 skulls. If he's right, then this swamp could be the key to learning about a society so ancient that most traces have vanished until now. Their 7,000-year-old secrets lie at the bottom of the bog, but a colossal obstacle stands in the archaeologists' way. Millions of gallons of water. How can they excavate an area at the bottom of a bog? It takes 2 years to come up with a solution, emptying the marsh. It's an epic engineering operation, sinking 150 well points into the peat, pumping out 700 gallons of water a minute, round the clock. As the marsh bed comes into view and the excavating begins, the true scale of the discovery hits home. The handful of skulls discovered by accident are just the tip of the iceberg. There are more skeletons, a lot more. Body after body of men, women and children. In fact, bodies virtually cover the entire bog floor. Most found in the fetal position, exactly as laid over 7 millennia ago. The archaeologists have found something unbelievably rare, a prehistoric burial ground. Dating tests reveal it was in use for 1,300 years. But who are these people? The quest for answers will spawn over 2 decades of investigation, right up to the present day, bringing together an expert team of scientists, from geneticists to forensic pathologists. This is no ordinary archaeological site. The incredible level of preservation gives the scientific world a chance to see things that the ravages of time normally destroy. The bones before the archaeologists look more like people who died just a few years ago. This astounding preservation happened accidentally because of their burial in peat. A cocoon of decomposed vegetation shut out the fungi and bacteria that normally cause bodies to decay. And unusually, the chemistry of Windover peat is non-acidic, preventing bone deterioration. If buried in dry earth, these bones would have completely disappeared after just a couple of years.
It's virtually an optimal environment. You couldn't ask for a better preservation medium.
Throughout the excavation, the team is continually stunned as they unearth not just bone, but things far more fragile and rare, miraculously saved by the bog. The first breathtaking discovery comes weeks into the dig, when the unearthing of unusually heavy skulls stops the archaeologists in their tracks.
It doesn't look like there's anything in there.
It's awfully heavy. There's something in there, but I can't see what.
Okay. We had removed a couple of skulls, and you could sort of see inside of them that there was also a mass in there.
Something is rattling around like a walnut inside a shell. And as they look within, they see a light-colored substance. Common sense tells them surely this is just peat. But in the back of everyone's mind, there is another unbelievable possibility. What is inside these Stone Age skulls? At the Windover Bog in Florida, news spreads fast of more skulls with a strange material inside.
It's awfully heavy. There's something in there, but I can't see what.
Okay.
An 8,000-year-old skull. That of a 45-year-old woman is rushed off to the University of Florida for further investigation by genetics expert Dr. Bill Houseworth.
It immediately became apparent that there was something inside. We figured it was peat.
An MRI scan lets the scientists see inside the skull cavity, leaving no doubt. There is something in there. The team of experts are about to witness an archaeological first. The time comes to remove the mass from the skull, and they are met by a truly astonishing sight.
There was complete silence. It was clear to everyone that we were looking at an 8,000-year-old human brain.
After millennia in the waterlogged grave, the brain is shrunk to a quarter of its normal size. But it's unmistakable. The scientists are shocked.
There were a number of four-letter words thrown around the lab. To find such an intact brain inside a perfectly preserved skull of the antiquity that we thought we were dealing with was unprecedented.
The brain sitting in front of Houseworth is no different from his own. Man hasn't evolved in 150,000 years, so the Windover people, although Stone Age hunter-gatherers, had all of the mental capabilities of today's modern man.
An 8,000-year-old human brain is a fully modern human. There is no difference. The thought process would have been the same. Although these brains are perhaps twice as old as the pyramids, it's as modern man.
It's an archaeological first, soon followed by many more. At the excavation site, brain after brain is unearthed. So miraculously, Houseworth soon has 91 prehistoric brains in his freezer. If these brains have survived, it dawns on him that maybe something else has survived, that he can attempt what other scientists have only imagined, something that is until now the stuff of science fiction.
We then actually cut through the brain, looked at the structure, and that's actually when we began to think that there might actually be human DNA there, because the structure of the brain at the microscopic level was so perfectly preserved, you could even see cell structure.
If they find DNA inside the cell, it would at this time be the oldest human DNA ever recovered. The hunt is on. In a pioneering technique, the ancient brain cells are mixed with enzymes and put through cooling and shaking apparatus to separate any DNA that might be remaining inside. 7 millennia in the waterlogged swamp should have totally destroyed it. But when the results come back, early signs look tantalizing. The genetics team can instantly see they have found DNA, and it's not from vegetation in the marsh. This is human. But they have to be cautious. It could be modern DNA, accidentally carried over from anyone handling the brains, a frequent problem known as contamination. Houseworth needs definite proof. Is this DNA modern or prehistoric? He compares the Windover DNA to DNA of various ethnic groups, and eureka! It looks Native American. The early inhabitants of America descended from people who had crossed over from Asia at the end of the Ice Age. The DNA of these Native Americans is easily distinguished from all other ethnic groups. So when Houseworth sees that the Windover DNA is a distinct Native American type, he knows that the impossible has happened. He has actually recovered Stone Age DNA. With no Native Americans on his team, the possibility of modern contamination can be safely ruled out.
They were clearly American Indians. There was 8,000-year-old DNA. There was DNA that we could rescue and analyze genetically.
The amazing run of fortune at Windover continues. Not only are there 91 prehistoric brains, but the oldest human DNA in the world at this time has been recovered from them. Science fiction has become science fact. By now, archaeologists have uncovered nearly 100 sets of human remains across the entire Windover Marsh. The bones of these earliest Americans begin to tell their stories, and they are somewhat surprising. These people were taller than people from much later cultures. Forensics show that some Windover men stood nearly 6 foot. Their bone density reveals they were healthy and certainly weren't just eking out a meager existence on the edge of starvation. This part of Florida supplied the Windover people with bountiful food. Now a state-of-the-art technique is able to analyze their diet to solve a further mystery, the riddle of where the Windover bog bodies actually came from. Noreen Chouros of the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. is carrying out a new advanced technique called radioisotopic analysis. It measures minute traces, called stable isotopes, of certain chemicals in the bones.
We get bone from the archaeologist, very small pieces, and then we dry it, and we essentially weigh a piece of it into a little tin boat and drop it in a machine, and out comes stable isotope numbers.
Water has its own distinct chemical fingerprint, which changes depending on where it's found in the world. This fingerprint can be detected in the most minute amount of hydrogen in the bones. As luck would have it, archaeologists found the skeletons of local animals that died in the bog around the same time as the humans. By comparing the hydrogen fingerprint of the people to the animals, Noreen will soon find out if they were both drinking the same water, and so both living around the area of the bog. As results appear on the screen, the answer straight away becomes clear.
The hydrogen isotopes of the people and the hydrogen isotopes of the animals are completely different. You would assume that if they were drinking the same water source and sort of eating the same food as some of the animals, that they'd be quite similar. And because they were completely different, it's said that they can't have been eating the same food, drinking the same water as a lot of those animals, and they must have been going elsewhere for their food intake and their water intake. The animals lived and stayed near the coastline. The humans did not.
This advanced technology has solved a mystery. Windover was not their home. The people who were buried here were nomadic, traveling around the Florida peninsula according to the season. Until the discovery of their cemetery, everyone thought that Stone Age nomadic people would have simply buried their dead where they fell. But the Windover people were different.
Typically in hunter-gatherer societies, you see the dead are usually buried fairly close to where they die. They tend to be pretty well scattered across the landscape where they live, where they camp. But clearly in this part of Florida, around Windover and Central and South Florida, people were bringing their dead back to central locations.
These people carried their dead, sometimes over great distances, to this particular burial place. But why was it so important to return them to Windover? What was so special about this place that singled it out as a burial ground for over 1,000 years? One clue lies in the excavation artifacts. Next to the skeletons, archaeologists are finding jewelry, ornaments and weapons, highly valued offerings that had been ritually placed with the dead in the funeral ceremony.
I think the simplest interpretation is there was some concept about an afterlife or a place after you leave this earth. There was an effort at preparation to place the person into, if you will, a good place in the next life and to give them some of the things they would need in the next life.
The Windover Pond was a sacred place for these people. Perhaps water was seen as a gateway to the afterlife, a portal to the underworld, the realm of the dead.
If you see the pond as a barrier between the living and the dead, and that pond it functionally acts as a gateway, if you will, to the next world. And that may well have been the way people looked at and thought about the pond.
Their beautifully crafted offerings to the next world give early signs that the skills of these Stone Age people were perhaps more advanced than anyone had thought. But nothing has prepared the archaeologists for their next discovery, something even rarer than the brains. They start to find skeletons wrapped in something that incredibly looks like textile. If this proves true, it'll be beyond their wildest dreams. Conventional wisdom has it that textiles were not made this far back in time, and that people were simply clothed in animal hides. They need to know what the substance is. So America's foremost expert on ancient fabric, Dr. James Edavasio, flies to the scene.
I and my late wife, Rhonda, went down and walked on the site. They physically uncovered the suspect area in one of the burials, and the light was just perfect to indicate that that's exactly what it was, were textile remains.
They have at their fingertips the oldest twine textile in the Americas. Again, the impossible happens at Windover.
I asked Jim, I said, was it worth the plane ticket to Florida? And he stood up and he says, you better believe it. This is like nothing we've ever seen.
Until this moment, no one has imagined that such an ancient culture had the technological know-how to produce fabric, let alone fabric of such startling complexity. These exquisitely crafted fragments are junking the history book image of the hide-clad hunter-gatherer. They were no primitive people. They were highly skilled weavers, way before anyone had believed.
And after the requisite leaping up and down and screaming and yelling, we decided to then figure out where to go next with all this.
The Stone Age fabric is disintegrating before their very eyes. As they lift it from the peat cocoon that's protected it for thousands of years, it just dries out and crumbles away.
Preservation conditions in the bog are extraordinary. And so, for instance, if you were to peel off a layer of peat that might contain a leaf that had fallen in at the time the peat was deposited, for a very brief instant that leaf would be bright green and fresh as if it fell off today. And then within seconds it would shrivel up and turn brown.
The team do their best by keeping the fabric wet and sealing it in airtight containers. But if they don't find a long-term solution fast, the Stone Age relics will literally fall to pieces. Meanwhile, in Wisconsin, chemist Bruce Humphrey is pioneering a revolutionary preservation technique called paraleaning.
The place where paralean really shines in the preservation world is with the most fragile, the most degraded materials that would otherwise perhaps be lost.
A layer of clear polymer, so thin that it's almost invisible, coats the fragile object. Humphrey demonstrates using a wisp of paper burnt to ash.
The coating cycle is now complete. Inside is our cell with the ash paper. And in a little over an hour's time, we've transformed this fragile, friable material to a completely handleable substrate. If we compare it with its other cousin over here that wasn't treated, you can see the extreme difference in handleability. This is a film of paralean. As you can see, it's not unlike saran wrap. So invisible is it that we can do amazing things. To give you an example, this material is from RMS Titanic. This is a magazine that we theorize belonged to a first-class passenger. It was rolled up and casually put in a suitcase and spent 85 years on the bottom of the ocean at 12,600 feet.
Could paralean come to the rescue of the Windover artifacts? An anxious James Edavasio persuades Bruce Humphrey to try out the process on a rapidly decaying fabric sample, something never tried before. When it emerges from the paralean chamber, Edavasio is stunned. This Stone Age textile can now be freely handled, where before it would have just fallen to pieces.
This piece that I'm orienting, to be able to pick it up, to be able to show it to you, is impossible to put into words compared to the fragility of the specimen when we first encountered it.
Thanks to paraleaning, Edavasio is able to minutely examine the Stone Age fabric for signs of wear and tear.
One of the most striking things about the fabrics is they probably represent, at least in some cases, items that were worn in life that the person was subsequently interred wearing. Whereas with the infants, the wear is considerably less or non-existent at all, which suggests to us they were made on order.
An elaborate death ceremony involving all the care and respect of a modern-day funeral is beginning to emerge.
When someone died in the area, you wrapped them in a garment or a blanket. There was a procession to the pond.
The body is placed beneath the waters of the bog and held under the water by driving stakes in the corners of the fabric so that you're in effect pinning the body to the bottom of the bog.
These people would have felt all of the same emotions that you and I feel when a loved one, when a neighbor, when a friend passes away. It is part of the human condition. It's part of human nature.
It was a death ritual that was performed here for 1,300 years. The riddle of why they returned to this place for so long is about to be solved in more pioneering science. Geneticist Bill Houseworth's analysis of the prehistoric DNA continues. As he compares the genetic sequences from brains across the whole lifespan of the cemetery, he notices something amazing.
What we found is that in many instances they had nearly the identical sequence or the identical sequence that spanned the full 1,300 years of this site.
Identical DNA types can only come from people in the same family, so for Houseworth, this means one thing.
So they're related to each other, and they're really from the same tribe, if you will. We have a population that existed at the same site for many, many years.
The bog held a Stone Age dynasty. Generation upon generation of a single interrelated clan were returning their dead here as a family tradition. It became a place to reunite the recently dead with their forebears, and a shrine where ancestors were remembered and honored. And because the tribe's DNA remained unchanged over a millennia, it shows they hadn't interbred with outsiders. In this age, it was perhaps rare to come into contact with other tribes. It's the first time ever DNA is answering questions about the lives of such ancient people. Their Native American genetic type tells us they look much like today's Native Americans, with dark hair, eyes and skin. But Glenn has always wanted to find out exactly what the Windover tribe would have looked like. Only now can he combine the DNA results with the latest facial reconstruction technology to produce an accurate picture. Science is about to bring us face to face with the Stone Age. Archaeologist Glenn Doran comes to Glasgow University, home to one of the world's leading facial reconstruction departments. DNA analysis of the Windover brains tells him that the tribe would have looked similar to modern Native Americans. Now he's about to witness the very first computerized reconstruction of a 7,000-year-old face. He's chosen one of Windover's oldest women, a 70-year-old, to be brought back from the grave.
Mentally, we may have some picture of what we think the person may have looked like. So it should be very interesting to see those soft tissue features, in a sense, come alive after 7,000 years.
Forensic pathologist Professor Peter Venezes uses his advanced computer program to help police identify modern murder victims. He's confident it'll now produce a true picture of how this prehistoric woman looked in the flesh.
It's quite eerie, really, because we know that our forensic technique seems to work for modern cases, and so we have a good idea that what we're producing for the ancient cases is not going to be too far from what the person actually looked like.
First, an infrared scan of the woman's skull creates a 3D computer model. The software then wraps skin around the bone, and her classic Native American look begins to emerge. Finally, they're about to add in details of facial features, her dark skin, hair and eyes. And for the first time, Glenn will come face to face not with an archaeological discovery, but a real person.
I think she really does look great. I've spent 20 years looking at her without flesh, so it's kind of interesting to see a rendering with facial features on there. She is one of the most gracile, as well as one of the oldest individuals on the whole site. It's been worth the trip and worth the effort.
I really hope so. I know you've had
She looks out into the world once more. But this woman has even more to tell. Among her bones, archaeologists found over 3,000 elderberry seeds. Incredibly, these were the contents of her stomach, her final meal 7 millennia ago. Elderberry is known to have medicinal qualities, so perhaps her relatives were trying to ease the pain of a condition that caused her death. When Glenn sees the unusual spinal column of a Windover skeleton, he knows for sure that these people were looking after their sick and needy.
What you see is what's referred to as a midline failure. And so instead of bone closing over the lower portion of the spinal cord, it's remained open, and that leads to some other fairly profound health consequences.
This is a disease many still suffer from today, spina bifida. With the spinal cord exposed, nerve damage occurred, leading to paralysis of the legs.
In this particular individual, one of the consequences was, in fact, a very massive infection in the lower limb. This person clearly was not as mobile as other individuals of his or her age.
In a more savage, less developed society, the ill or deformed might have been abandoned or even killed. But this person lived on into his teens, so someone must have been caring for him. Every time the tribe moved camp, he had to be carried. Even though he was little help in feeding the community, they kept him going. And when they could do no more, granted him the same spiritual burial as anyone else. So far, it seems that the Windover tribe led a peaceful existence. Skeletons show hardly any signs of trauma. But then, the archaeologists make a shocking discovery. At the 102nd grave, archaeologists find a spearhead carved from a deer's antler. At first, they assume that it's an offering to accompany the person into the next world. But as they investigate further, the reality looks far more sinister.
And then as we cleared more and more of it away, we realized that, it wasn't just an offering, that the point of it was deeply embedded in bone. It really did sort of make you stop and realize this man had been killed.
Perhaps life for the Windover people was not so peaceful after all. The crucial question is, was this an accident or was this murder? Dr. Mike Warren is an expert in violent trauma from the University of Florida. The police call on his expertise at homicide scenes to determine how the victim was killed. But today, he's on his way to investigate a death that happened over 7,000 years ago. Now, 2 decades after the Windover dig, Glenn hopes Mike's forensic knowledge will finally solve the riddle of the man buried with a spearhead. Bones are a permanent record of a person's life, whether they died yesterday or thousands of years ago.
Glenn, this is remarkable preservation. If this skeleton showed up in my laboratory, I would have no idea that it is almost 8,000 years old. Even our shallow graves from homicides 10, 15, 20 years ago are not this well preserved.
With the same forensic techniques he uses to identify a modern-day murder victim, Mike builds a profile of this ancient person.
The hip bone is the most diagnostic of sex, simply because females are built differently. They are built to bear children, and some of the shapes of the bones in here tell us that this was undoubtedly a male.
There's more to be learnt from the man's bones.
There's a very diagnostic area in here called the pubic symphysis, and the face of the pubic symphysis, and the shape of this, and the fact that you see these little ridges and grooves
still across there.
Right, the ridge and furrow system is still there, and that tells us that this individual was probably in late 20s or early 30s.
So he was in the prime of his life when he met an untimely end.
Well, certainly, by this point in his life, he's mastered all of the skills that a hunter-gatherer fisher of this time period would have to have. He probably knew the area like the back of his hand. He's just as in control of his world and environment as anybody at this time period would be.
It was probably on an everyday hunting trip when something catastrophic happened to this man. But how did he die? What happened on his final day? They turn their attention to the suspicious injury to the man's hip. The spearhead has snapped off since the excavation, but its tip has remained firmly embedded in the bone for over 7,000 years. An X-ray of his pelvis clearly shows it's been driven in with amazing power.
Well, you can see how deeply this has penetrated into the bone.
Really penetrated in there and stuck. And that took quite a bit of force. As on first blush, when you walk up, that almost looks like a bullet.
Mike starts to speculate. The power needed to make such a wound could have been generated by the Stone Age equivalent of a gun, an ancient hunting tool known as an atlatl, which turbocharges a spear throw. Experimental archaeologist Tom Penders has reconstructed how the atlatl was made.
Here's a spear. It's got an antler point on it. This is mounted on what's known as a foreshaft. Now, the spear could have been used alone, but it's most effective with being used with an atlatl, or a spear thrower. Now, how this works is the atlatl adds an extra punch and gives you extra distance when you're hunting. It makes your arm longer and used as a better lever for throwing a spear. As you can see, it has an antler atlatl weight mounted on there. So they would have taken a spear, and here's that hook, placed it right there at the spur, and throw it, just like you're using a hammer or using a tennis racket.
With this added leverage, the atlatl could launch the spear to over 100 miles an hour, increasing its force by over 2.5 times. So powerful, it could easily bring down a deer or bison in one shot.
These were the cutting-edge tools for their time. This is the stealth bomber of their time.
Could the Windoverman have been a victim of friendly fire, killed accidentally by a fellow huntsman's spear?
Makes the stories...
In the anthropology lab, Glenn and Mike test this hunting accident line of inquiry. They use a skeletal model of the human pelvis to work out the spear's trajectory when it penetrated his body. This is where the projectile went in, the back of the pelvis, below the belt line.
So it's coming from lower down to up, like this.
Exactly.
This trajectory is crucial, because if the spear was thrown from a distance using an atlatl, its flight path would have been arched, so the spear point would have entered the body sloping downwards. But this point was angled upwards. Instantly, this rules out a long-range spear injury.
If you look at trajectories of atlatls, it's real hard for me to figure out how that would have happened. It seems much more likely that maybe the person, was already down,
right,
and you were coming up behind them like that. Does that make sense?
Intuitively, it makes a lot more sense that they're already down.
It seems the man was laying face front when somebody came to pound in the dart, surely with the intention to kill.
How could this have been an accidental injury? And, I keep coming up with the same answer, that I just don't see how this is accidental.
This is unquestionably a case of murder. Forensics show that the stab wound hadn't healed, proving that it happened at the time of death. But the question is, have they found the fatal injury? Could this have killed him?
All of the major vessels and nerves run on the inside of the pelvis down through the sciatic notch, so there's really nothing vital back here that this hit that would have caused this person to hemorrhage to death, or there's no vital organs or anything that really are in contact there. Yet we know that it's a perimortem injury because there's no evidence of healing.
From what you're saying, that actually tells us that this is not the fatal injury.
I think a medical examiner, a forensic pathologist would look at this case and they would say, well, the cause of death is indeterminate, but the manner of death certainly appears like it's a homicide. Yeah. Something killed him, but not this dart.
Another fatal injury probably happened before this, perhaps a spear in the back, which penetrated between his ribs and so left no trace on the skeleton. As he lay prone, he was unable to defend himself against the next strike. Such an isolated case of bloodshed, in a time when Florida was sparsely populated, suggests this was no large-scale warfare between rival tribes. The motive for attack had to be something else.
I see this probably as a significant disagreement between two individuals.
A homicide.
A homicide.
Instead of war.
It was a one-on-one attack by someone who had a personal score to settle.
On so many levels, it sounds like you're talking about today, though. Our forensic cases are cases where two people are in a disagreement. Now, what they're arguing over is different, has a different theme, but it is still the same type of situation.
Most conflict was, argument between individuals. Some sort of issue about a hunting territory, a personal affront, a personal injury. I mean, it takes a lot of anger to actually, do this kind of injury to somebody.
But there's evidence of an even more gruesome act carried out on the victim. When archaeologists excavated his grave, it became clear that whilst the rest of his body was intact, something crucial was missing: his skull.
So the plot thickens. So you've got a projectile point that shows that there was some foul play, and you have a missing head, and the fact that you have the skeleton so well represented, but the cranium, which is the most obvious, largest part of the skeleton, is missing, to me, is very suspicious.
Increasing the intrigue, every neighboring skeleton buried around him in the bog was wholly intact with their skulls, so the shifting of peat cannot explain the mystery. It leaves them with only one truly horrific explanation. One of the most intriguing skeletons unearthed from the Windover Bog, 7,000 years after his death, presents forensic pathologist Mike Warren and archaeologist Glenn Doran with a riddle to decipher. He was found with a spear point lodged in his pelvis, but stranger still, his head was missing. Could he really have been decapitated?
Certainly in later time periods, there are Native American traditions where the heads of enemies were in fact taken and removed from the field of battle.
As Mike studies the victim's skeleton, he finds a crucial piece of evidence. Not only is the head missing, but also the top 3 neck bones, the cervical vertebrae. He explains using a model.
Here's a model skull, and here are the 3 cervical vertebrae that are missing in the Wendover Pond specimen, and that's where the head was removed.
Mike has seen exactly the same situation in modern cases of decapitation. Looking closer for any further clues, he notices a small protruding part of the neck bone is missing.
The back of this bone has been fractured. Now, I don't know whether that's around the time of death or not, but again, a good explanation is that they just simply cut down through there and then flip that off with using some force.
Now there is no other explanation. He was decapitated. In a grisly and bloody process, the assailant probably hacked down to the neck bone with a sharp stone tool, and then repeatedly rocked the head back until it came off.
It wasn't a samurai type of decapitation that you think about from watching TV, where the head was just removed in one fell swoop. Being expert butchers of deer and game animals, this is not something that would be unfamiliar to them.
From their forensic analysis, Glenn builds a picture of what may have happened on the victim's last day alive.
This is a very unusual event. This was an unusual circumstance. It was probably very shocking. This was a young man in, full vigor, went out, on a hunting expedition. It may have taken him to the edge of his territory, so to speak.
Someone was perhaps stalking him. Someone from a neighboring tribe who held a long-standing grudge. The assailant chose his moment to strike, like he was hunting a wild animal. A first injury took the victim down. and as he lay unguarded, the enemy came to drive another spear in his pelvis, which remained embedded for thousands of years. The desire to inflict harm must have been immense, for after he died, the assailant took a stone tool and removed the head. This was the ultimate display of superiority over his enemy. The head was taken as a trophy of his total victory. When his tribe discovered the body, they were surely horrified to see him so barbarically mutilated.
Would have had a big impact in the community. He was known by everybody. He was related to many of them. So it was probably a pretty traumatizing event.
His headless corpse was taken back to the bog to be ritually buried alongside his ancestors. 7,000 years later, their cemetery has astonished archaeologists around the world. But the story is not over. Future advances in science will continue to solve more riddles about these Stone Age Americans. Developments in DNA testing could make incredible things possible. Their genes could allow us to construct a prehistoric family tree showing how the skeletons were related to each other, help find the Windover tribe's modern-day relatives, and answer the bigger question of how and when the earliest settlers migrated to America. The people from the bog are teaching us things about the past that we would never otherwise have known.
I've often told people, you know, I'm probably the luckiest archaeologist alive. It really is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. You know, we'll probably never have another chance to look at a site like Windover again.